Every person carries a story. Stories shaped by choices, by struggle, by growth. This is where those stories are told. This is the power of human stories.
There are a lot of people who talk about people-first leadership. Far fewer actually live it in a way that the people around them can feel. Today, I get the pleasure of having a conversation with Kris Cravey. Kris is an operating partner at Pelican Energy Partners and has spent the last couple of decades working across operations, strategy, and leadership in industries like power generation, professional services, and technology. Over the years, he's held leadership roles at Day & Zimmerman, and he's also served as Chief People Officer at DroneUp, and later as Chief Operating Officer and President at Fahrenheit Advisors. Along his work in industry, Kris teaches leadership and organizational behavior at Palm Beach Atlantic University and writes about leadership, culture, and execution for Fast Company. What I appreciate about Kris is how he approaches leadership. In the time I've known him, I've seen how others around him experience that. People genuinely feel like he cares, and that's rare. Kris understands that leadership isn't just about strategy or performance, it's about people. So, welcome to the podcast, Kris. Great to have you.
Thanks, Rolando. Yeah, I appreciate it.
So, let's turn back the clock about 6 years ago.
Yeah.
You're teaching in Messiah University's MBA program, and we met and we hit it off, and then you became my professor. And fast forward a couple years later, after my MBA, you've had a really interesting career, just jumping to a couple organizations. I've always thought your career trajectory was really interesting, and also just the way I've seen you lead has always been, I think, something noteworthy for me as I've take notes. So I'm excited to sit down with you and just share a little bit about your story and what you've learned in all the different places you've been. So yeah, thanks for being here and thanks for saying yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I still remember the first time we met because you were kind of on the fence about whether or not you wanted to do an MBA program. And when you and I had a chance to talk, I was like, I've got to get this young guy in this program because he's fantastic. So glad you decided to join that program, and we've built a great friendship over the years. Yeah, to your point, I've had a pretty non-linear career background, and I'm sure it's some things that we can talk about and get into, including even my educational background is somewhat non-linear. But it all seemed to kind of work together to point me in the right direction over the years. So
let's dive in then. Okay, so let's go back even further, maybe your grad education or even undergrad education, or before that. Like, honestly, what was those first formative years for you like? What drew you into leadership, people, and organizational life?
Yeah. Well, I think going back to when I was a kid, I was the first one in my family to go to college, right? So that was a pretty big deal. So I was raised by my grandparents. My mom and dad got a divorce when I was about a year old. And so they felt like the best, most stable place for me would be with my grandparents. And so I was raised by my grandparents in Northern California. And back then, Northern California was still very agricultural and country, hence the cowboy hats in my roots, for sure. We'll talk more about that later. But I think one of the things that I saw with my grandparents was just the struggle. Right. And, we weren't very well off. We lived in a mobile home in San Jose. And of course, back then, it was all agricultural fields in this little mobile home park. And now it's like Google and all these tech companies. And that mobile home park's still there, if you can believe that. And we moved from there to another mobile home park out in the Central Valley. And I would see people, they would, bring my family groceries, and I just saw the struggle. And so my grandparents kind of had this mentality, and I think some of that was part of their generation of, you got to find a company and find a good company and then work there all your life and, get your pension And then, you're just kind of a good soldier, in that company. And what I kind of discovered though is, as times evolved and changed, that a lot of companies didn't care as much about their employees as sometimes people thought they were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they were a cog or a kind of a sprocket in the machine. And if that cog or sprocket broke, then they just replaced it. And so there were a lot of people that found, whether their pensions were gone, or they didn't offer pensions anymore, that reality just wasn't there. So I always kind of saw the struggle that they had. So for me, it was like, how do I take initiative? How do I get beyond that? And so I really applied myself to studies. Now, my grandfather and my uncle, they were very mechanically inclined. They could do anything. They could weld, they could do carpentry, they could do whatever. I actually wish now as an adult that I would have paid more attention because I could use some of those, skills today. I was more into sports and I was more into school and really kind of focusing on like, okay, what do I need to, how do I create a career? And so for me, I knew that I was going to go to college. That was, that was definitely the direction I needed to go. I just wasn't exactly sure where I was going to go or what the domain was going to be. For me, I had a very, I came up in a Christian family, but we weren't really, I don't know, we kind of Christian by name, if that makes any sense. Like we didn't really go to church, that kind of thing. But when I was 18, after I graduated high school, I really had a surrendering, if you will, to God of like, I want to give you my life, surrendering my heart to him. And it really, to me, that was such a foundational moment for me because it really changed my direction and trajectory. And so some of those formative years that I had, I was fortunate in the church that I was going to, and this was back in the early 90s. And you really didn't have like mega churches back then, but I'd probably consider this a mega church, probably 3,000 or 4,000 people. But they had a big youth group. So like probably 400 or 500 youth that would get together and have services. Well, what was interesting to that is that, the pastor of the church there was very much a visionary. He was a great public speaker. He knew how to encourage people. He had a genuine love for people. It didn't matter, where you were in your socioeconomic status, like, that was always a place for you to be. And he liked finding diamonds in the rough. And I think that experience really got me exposed to something that I had never seen before. So I mentioned my family had come up more in trades. And now I was seeing this whole side of organizations where you cast vision and, you have a strategy and you think about how do we develop people and teams and how do we work together and how do we do things with excellence? And I just kind of couldn't get enough of that. Right. So at the time, I really tried to change my trajectory and I decided to go to Bible college and thought I was going to be a pastor. And so I got on staff at the church and did a lot of preaching and then eventually decided I wanted to go to seminary. Got a scholarship in Virginia and moved. My wife and I had been married for about a year and moved from California all the way to Virginia to go to school. And so while I was in seminary, I kind of needed a job to pay the bills. Mm-hmm. And a guy I was going to church with said, "Hey, I work in the energy field. We use a lot of union building trades. We need someone who can handle all the union fringes and all that." And I said, "I have no idea what that means, but sign me up because I need a job." Right. So I got working there and this company had a great tuition reimbursement program. They would cover anything that was related to business. And so I decided, being a pastor, it might be good to have a seminary degree and an MBA just because of, you're managing, an organization. Mm-hmm. And then I think for me, the real pivotal moment was, my window was pretty small at that juncture in terms of, how do I serve God or what's the best way to do that? And I kind of my only experience was either being a pastor or was a worship leader or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I got into this business program and I saw people who were just as passionate about doing good works in the marketplace. And that was very, very attractive to me. And I think it really for me, it kind of opened my window to say, God is much bigger than the box that I put him in, and that God is at work in all of these different things that we do. So my faith was certainly, I think, a pivotal moment of that. And I think the exposure that I had early on, being part of a church that really valued people and organization and excellence, I think kind of fed that fire that would later help me in organizations and businesses that I'd be a part of.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that the church actually showed you that. Oftentimes it can be the reverse.
Absolutely.
It can be like any small nonprofit, it's dysfunctional,
100%.
Scarcity mindset. They don't invest in their people.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you had a positive experience that showed you, oh, this could be something that could be a career path for me.
Yeah.
I also heard you say how you had that tension of having a moment in your life where your values become clear and you're motivated by what you want to do for the rest of your life, a calling of sorts, and then reimagining that calling could be in a different industry than what you thought. First it was going to be in the church space, typical pastor's career. And now you had this awakening, like, wait a second, I can do good over here. Walk me through that. Was that difficult for you to make that switch? Did you feel like guilty leaving behind the higher calling? What was that like, or was that easy for you?
Yeah, no, it was a wrestle. And I would say it was a wrestle for, maybe a decade or more, honestly, because there's this tension of, am I doing the will of God, right? Or am I doing what God wants me to do, or am I best using my resources effectively for God? And I kind of come to the conclusion that it doesn't really work that way. There's this there's kind of this principle. I believe it's in like metaphysics and thermodynamics. And they use this illustration where they talk about a river. And they said a river's flowing kind of from one destination to another. And among it, there's many like bends and curves and rocks and things like that. But the river continues to flow regardless of that. And so sometimes, we might throw a boulder into the river, but what does the river do? The river just kind of goes around the boulder and it just keeps flowing, right? And so I kind of looked at when I think about like God's will or those kind of types of things that are, in our lives, is like, you can't disrupt that, right? As much as you might try, like you might throw a rock in there or you might make a bad decision or whatever, but at the end of the day, the river is going to continue flowing in the direction it needs to go to as long as you're open to that. And so I really started looking at, what are the doors that are opening for me, right? And really kind of operating more like, I call it a green light versus a red light. I used to be like, everything's a red light. All right, I got to stop, got to think about this. I got to consult with a bunch of people. I need to pray about it. I need to do all these kinds of things. And instead it's like, what are the doors that I actually see opening and how do I begin to step through those? Right. And that's really kind of how it boiled down. So, but it was definitely a struggle. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. Well, whether it's God focused or whether it's just, people that they want to do something great with their lives. They want to have legacy. They want to have mission. They want to have purpose. Is this taking me off that trajectory? Right. I think
there's external pressure from other things like parents and societal expectations on them. It's hard to discern what you're supposed to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, even my family, not my wife or my kids, because my wife has always been my biggest fan and biggest champion, but my, my rest of my family, they were always kind of naysayers, you know what I mean? So again, they had that mentality, go work in a job, stay there forever. Don't take risks, don't take challenges, just kind of live status quo. But I saw what that kind of brought, right? So I think you have to have initiative. You have to have resourcefulness. You have to get out there and take some risks. And because, what's the worst thing that can happen? Okay, yeah, you could fail, you can make a mistake, but all right, you learn a lot from that, right? And at the end of the day, the river keeps flowing, and but you got to get in the river if you're gonna reach the destination, right? You can't sit on the banks.
Yeah. And you just reminded me of something you said earlier in your story with you observing your grandparents and the social contract that they adhered to,
Yeah.
which that's so as a millennial, I'm always either on the like maybe 5 years ago, our generation was the target of like those hit pieces in Forbes and all the we were the lazy generation, or now it's Gen Zers, now it's Gen Alpha, but
Yeah.
observing how the social contract has changed over the past couple decades. I think you said that early on that you started noticing, wait a second, the loyalty, the dedication and commitment that we used to have towards organizations and they would take care of us. You started seeing that in your youth falling apart.
Absolutely.
And that is a quite interesting like observation, because some people would perhaps say, oh, it's not going to happen to me. I'm going to try to stick to the script and maybe I'll come out of this with, a steady job. But now it's like, wow, fast forward however many years and now living in the AI like disruption, it's the social contract is way more different than ever.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. And I mean, just as recently as last week, I had a friend call me who had been with a company for, 2 decades and got let go, didn't see it coming, and got no severance, got nothing. Right. And it's like he dedicated a big portion of his life there, and all of a sudden it was gone like that. And it wasn't because he was fired for cause or anything like that. Right. So, I think that's the thing that, and I think organizations don't always realize that either, because it's almost like they expect, okay, well, you're going to sign this non-compete, right? And you're going to be loyal to me, but I don't have to give you anything in return, right? And at any point in time, your employment's at will, and I can get rid of you. And, so people feel that, right? And then they wonder why, people start to become the CEOs of their career, and they kind of jump from organization to organization because, either the company they're with won't pay them market value anymore, right? Because they have HR principles in place that says I can't give you above a 3% or a 5%, right? So they got to go somewhere else to get their value. And then they maybe come back to that organization, 5 years later to make what they should have made. Or, they don't see the commitment from the organization on whether it's their career development or the long-term, just overall trajectory for their career,
And the principles you're describing, like me and you have had so many conversations about these things over the last few years, and I know that you get it, but have you always gotten it? Talk to me a little bit about your discovery and your journey into that culture space, that organizational development space. How did that go after you switched over you left the pastoral thing behind, you moved into corporate? Talk to me about your journey into some of these things, because today you're very passionate about it.
Yeah.
A lot of people know that you get it, but did you always get it?
No, I didn't always get it, but I could observe it. So my first job out of college was actually quite humorous. So I worked for a large telecommunications company, and so at the time, the recruiter really sold me on this job, right? And so you're just fresh out of college, so you're looking for like, okay, what's this next opportunity? And it was supposed to be near my house. It turned out it was like an hour and a half drive away, but I needed a job, just got married, so I was going to go after it. So the recruiter described it as, man, you're going to be leading teams, you're going to be doing presentations, you're going to be doing all these things. I'm like, oh, this sounds fantastic. You're going to have a seat at the table. And then I got into the job, and it was working in the procurement department, basically as a secretary for the director of procurement and admin. And what I found with the gentleman that I worked for, I mean, he was like super smart. But his team, who were all very qualified people who, they had MBAs, they were lawyers, they were contract managers. No matter what they brought to his desk, like he had to mark it up. Like it was never good enough. It was always a problem. And I saw what it kind of did to the morale of the people. Plus just working for it, this was kind of the funniest thing I'd ever heard. I remember one time he was going on a business trip and he said, hey, Kris, while I'm gone, I'd like you to go into my desk and organize my paper clips. I'd like them all to point in the same direction. And I started laughing because I thought he was joking. And then he had this real serious look. He's like, no, I'm being serious.
Oh
So
my
that was kind of
goodness.
my first exposure of like, he obviously had his own quirks, but he was also creating a culture within his team of this kind of perfectionism culture and, afraid to make a mistake. And it just didn't bring the best out of people, where he had a peer right next door that people loved to work for that guy. Right. And it really brought their best out. So I think that was some of the early exposure that I had to culture. The next opportunity though really was, I got working in the energy field, and particularly I worked with a lot of engineering construction companies. And our company was going through an issue with safety. Like, we were having people that were getting injured out on the job site. And at the time, there was this new research out. It was called the zero injury philosophy, zero injury technique. And the idea about it is like, how do we get people to change their beliefs about safety? Right. So, really our experiences kind of shape our beliefs, and then our beliefs kind of shape our values. And then that really shapes how we act or behave. And so a lot of times, if you think about what were people's experience they had at construction sites, well, people just get hurt. Right. And if you go way back in the day when you're building the Empire State Building, like, they literally factored in how many people they thought would die on that project. Right. That's unheard of today. Like, you would never factor in someone dying on a project. But you almost had to believe that, zero injury was possible. So some of it was really kind of changing people's philosophy of, can you work an hour injury free? Can you work a day injury free? Could you work 30 days injury free? And so it was really kind of changing people's experience and belief about what was possible. And we started to see the progress. And so all of a sudden, we went from, if you know anything about OSHA recordable rates, a 2.0, which is terrible, down to, 0.10, right, in terms of people getting injured. And a lot of that had to do with, people believing and the values being demonstrated that, that you can be safe. And some of that is it's changing behavior, because what often happens on a construction project is it's schedule pressure. You got to get this done, take shortcuts. It's the work versus, hey, you got to do this thing safely first, and then let's worry about schedule. So I think those were very formative for me and probably a real world example that I had to apply all of this kind of, learning and research I was doing, both in my master's and my PhD program around culture, of actually seeing it at work and seeing the tangible benefits that came out of that.
Was that during your time at Day & Zimmerman?
It was, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just for audience, that's like commercial nuclear and other commercial energy solutions?
Correct, yeah. So at the time, I was actually working for a company called the Atlantic Group that Day & Zimmerman bought, and then we kind of rolled that into Day & Zimmerman. But yeah, Day & Zimmerman did, and they still are the largest maintenance and construction provider for existing nuclear energy assets. So, think of, power generation, nuclear power plants across the country. They service just about all of those across the U.S. They also did a lot of coal work, natural gas, and kind of some of those adjacent industries as well.
Yeah, pretty important. And also, there's a lot of questions I could go down in this space as I'm thinking through it. The safety initiatives you led, how difficult was that to work with people that were like on the job, that were frontline? I don't want to use the term blue collar in a derogatory way, but rather someone who's out there that needs to get the job done. They don't want to get caught up in this fluffy corporate thing. How did you actually bring that to life for them? Yeah,
no, that's a great question. And I think this is, I talked earlier about, having a nonlinear path and how things connect. I one time heard a person say, throughout life, it's almost like this bookshelf, and each shelf has a bucket. And in that bucket, you're depositing knowledge and information and experiences and networks and those kinds of things. At the time, you don't really know how all those pieces connect or if that will add any value. But at some point in your life, those buckets start connecting
Mm-hmm.
and you realize, oh, wow, like I now see how all this comes together. And that's kind of been my story from an educational perspective, but even like working in construction, because I came out of blue collar roots, I never lost sight of that, right? I've always valued, folks who can work with their hands, who can do trades, whether it be, welding or carpentry or even working on a farm or a ranch, right? Those are things that I've always valued. So even though I came from more of a white collar approach, I always valued those things. I will say that, and this is something, I'll just do a little tangent here and then kind of answer your question. But
Sure.
I will say, going to work in an engineering and construction business, it's kind of like any industry or any way of life, is that people want to know if you're legit, and they value, and they really kind of place their assessment on whether you're legit is, did you come up how they came up,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if you're an engineering construction company, most people are engineers or they came up in a construction trade, right? Well, I didn't come that way, right? I came more from a business. I'm a pastor who became a businessman, right? And now I'm coming into the business. And so I was fortunate enough that I had a few champions in my career that could see past that, right? And they could see the value of, hey, you know what? Kris thinks differently about these things. Like if we could take his perspective with the engineers and the construction guys, like we could actually do something great here, right? And so I was fortunate to have some of those kinds of champions in my life. But this exists everywhere. Like in academia, it becomes, oh, well, what school did you go to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or what journal have you been published in, right? It even comes into cowboying. Are you a real cowboy? Did you grow up on a farm? Did you actually do this? And I kind of like there's a song by Luke Bryan. He said, like, what makes you country, right? And it's like, it could have been you grew up on a farm on a tractor. Or it could be you were just in your truck listening to Alabama and decided, man, I love the country way of life. And that's what brought me there, right? So we got to get past all this, like, how did you get there? And versus like, what do you bring to the equation and the value and the insight that you have, in a particular domain. So I think for me, I was able to connect with a lot of folks who were craft trade, blue collar, because of that. At the end of the day, though, you can't do it by edict. You can't do it by, oh, I'm going to write a policy. We had to get out in the field. We had to train. We had to provide real world experiences. We had to show them videos. We had to, show them, here are tools you can use to help make you safer, help them kind of unpack some of the real world experiences that they come in. What are the pressures that they feel when they're out on that job site, and it could even be things like, I remember going to one job site one time and we were having a lot of eye injuries, and it was at a coal plant. And there's this big duct, and it's just blowing coal dust out of this duct, right? I mean, people are walking by and just blowing coal dust. And I said, well, is somebody going to fix that? And they said, no, they'll just run it till it breaks. I was like, oh, wow.
Wow.
Well, I wonder why we have eye injuries, right? Well, people see that. Workers see that. You say, hey, you care about my eyes, but like you've created this condition where this stuff is just floating in the air, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of that is kind of understanding really from their perspective, like, is the organization, putting their money where their mouth is? Are they actually stepping up and doing the things that help keep us safe? And then really kind of working to get that buy-in. But it takes time. And at the end of the day, leadership is a lot of modeling the way. And so if a supervisor or manager doesn't model the behavior, like it just kills it like that, right? And that's really been my experience everywhere with culture, is that you can say whatever you want, you can have great value statements or whatever, but what leaders actually believe is how they behave. And so you shouldn't expect different results from that. You can say, hey, we value innovation and we value failing fast and being iterative. But then as soon as somebody fails, and you say, okay, well, who's getting fired? Mm-hmm. Like they certainly know, like, okay, you really don't value that. You just say that, right?
Yeah. So. I love how you ground it in beliefs too. Because I've seen people that struggle, that try to behave in a way, but they don't believe it. Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of that internal force of you're going to naturally fall back into your instinctive way. And if you don't believe in certain values, you can try really hard to kind of fake it, but you're only going to do so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's really where I've seen where culture fails, right? It's just lip service, right? It looks good, it sounds good, but until you can actually believe it, it's part of your values, you behave in such a way, you reinforce it, I mean, a good example of this, even from a performance perspective, we used to at Dane Zimmerman, we were always looking at continuous improvement and, how do we get better and how do we get out in front? And, but if you looked at the organization really valued the medic. And what I mean by that is that, they valued the person that when the project went off the rails, that they could go and recover it. And so I used to have this boss, he was president, his name was Tim Reddington, and he was an old gruff Boilermaker, had this really gruff voice. And he used to say, he goes, "We might not get it right the first time, but we can recover like a bastard." That was like his saying, we can recover it like that, right? We won't get it right the first time. So, but some of that was cultural, right? Is because when you looked at like, who were the heroes of the organization that people talked about, it was the guys who had pulled a project out of the ditch, or we were losing all this money and they figured out how to recover it, versus how do we get in front of that kind of stuff? Like, how do we become a learning organization that can actually go implement these things so we don't go off the track, right? But that really wasn't what was rewarded or valued, or, where the folklore was built, right?
Yeah.
So, culture, I mean, you can pick up culture pretty quick in an organization about, who are the heroes? What are the stories that are told? Those things tell you what they really value and what's important to them.
Paint a picture of what the energy industry was like when you were in back then. I know you're back in it on the PE side of things now, but what was it like 10, 15 years ago? Just again, I'm green. I don't know. A lot of our audience members are green to that. Just what kind of pressures, what was it like back then that informed the way you did business and
yeah. Well, when I got into nuclear in 2001, and it was a growing industry. We still had a lot of coal plants as well too, and really around right before the Fukushima incident happened, there was a lot of talk about kind of a nuclear renaissance, because you had some aging, plants and reactors, and building, new plants.
You had people like Bill Gates also pushing for nuclear. I watched his documentary, and he was basically saying, "Oh, this is the future," and then Fukushima happened.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody got scared. I mean, it's kind of interesting if you back up to 3 Mile Island, right, which is probably the biggest event that we had in the U.S., and you looked at the performance of those plants back then, and this kind of goes back to some of our culture conversation. The performance of the plants back then weren't great. I mean, you look at their safety numbers, you often look at capacity factor, which basically means, when this unit can produce electricity, are they online to be able to produce electricity? Back then it was like 52%, like it was really low. So after 3 Mile Island happened, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission came in and was like, "Hey, we've really got to tighten things up." And to be competitive in that space, the nuclear industry created what they call INPO, which is the Institute of Nuclear Power Operators. And you kind of think of it as like a think tank that says, if we're going to be able to be profitable in this very highly regulated market, we have to have superior performance. And so when you look at when that INPO was formed and the industry got together on how we can improve performance, now when you look at nuclear power plants, like their capacity factor is like 98%,
wow.
like almost online all the time. You look at their safety performance, it's less than 0.1. I mean, it's phenomenal, the change that happened from 3 Mile Island. And so we've been successfully operating nuclear power plants in the United States for a long, long time. When Fukushima happened, obviously there were some design issues with Fukushima. They never expected the backup diesel generators to get flooded. There were some human errors that happened because some of the other plants in Japan shut down immediately. One guy decided not to shut it down. It was too late. But that really kind of killed the industry at that point. And additionally, it was becoming very cost prohibitive in the US to build new nuclear. You used to be able to build it for, several hundred million, and now we're talking billions and billions of dollars, $30 billion to, put in, a new plant down at Vogtle. So cost became an issue, safety concerns became an issue, and then nuclear was kind of getting a bad rap in that they were not viewed as a clean energy, even though they're zero emission, even though they are clean energy. So now you had like solar and wind and other renewable resources who, when they actually produce the energy, they're in the red, but they get government subsidies to make them into the black, right? So they're actually not profitable in what they do. And so you imagine, competing, you have a nuclear power plant where you're not getting those subsidies or benefits, and now you're trying to compete with a subsidized benefit. It's a recipe for disaster. And so when I first got in the nuclear industry, everything was taken off. Then Fukushima happened. Then we went through this, some of the political aspects of this clean energy movement and nuclear not being included. So now they start shutting down plants. They're going through what they call the nuclear promise. So how do we get to drive costs out of the plants? And so it wasn't a great time then to be in nuclear, which is really kind of when I pivoted my career at that point in time. Now it's all the rage again. And part of what's happened is people have realized that, hey, this is a clean energy. We can operate it safely. And oh, by the way, with AI and data centers, like, we need power.
Yes.
And some of it is, and I know that people have a lot of different opinions, and even some of your viewers will have this as well, but you have to look at, I come from California. And so California uses a lot of solar during the day, but around 5 o'clock, they crank up their natural gas plant. So their carbon footprint stays flat. And then all of a sudden at 5 o'clock, it just soars through the roof, right? And so sometimes you're not getting the whole story around that. It's like, okay, you can't have enough battery storage to operate everything. You have to have baseload power. The wind doesn't always blow, and if it's blowing too fast, you can't run. If it's going too slow, you can't run them. If the sun's not shining, you got to have baseload power. And traditionally that's been coal and then nuclear. And so if we want to get off coal, you're going to have some type of baseload power that can run 24/7 in high capacity. So I think people are becoming more open to that, which is really what created opportunity for me in this private equity firm that I'm with, because the guys that started this firm, they were really focused more on oil and gas. And one of the founding partners, really before anybody was betting on nuclear, felt like, gosh, people are going to have to come back to nuclear. And so he started what was called a zero-based fund. And it was focused on, how do we support and acquire some of these businesses that are part of the supply chain of nuclear infrastructure. All those have to come in and do maintenance or electrical or welding work, or maybe they provide shielding or canisters or drums or whatever it is. How do we get around those companies that can help support our existing nuclear assets for years to come? And he made the right bet, because, it's coming back very, very strong, and it's got a lot of political support now.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just like many things, good ideas have to go through the meat grinder of like the political lens of things and the political discourse. And after they come out on the other side, so much is lost. And that's great to see that the tides are turning back to something, because I had looked into it a little bit when I watched that documentary. I was like, oh, this is so interesting. And now as we're recording this today, like, not to get political, the Strait of Hormuz is currently closed in Iran. There's an energy crisis in 20% of the world that gets their oil from there. And now, this energy industry that you're in, I'm sure is taking note of all of these global forces at play. It's not just a domestic decision for policy or for environmentalism or anything. It's now you have to look at how world markets react to things, and how has, and I'm gonna get back to the next stage of your career, but since you went into your current role at Pelican Energy, how are you guys navigating this like constant shifting landscape?
Yeah. Well, no, it's a good question, and probably the guys on the oil and gas side could probably speak better to that. it was kind of funny. I was at a conference about a month and a half ago, and there was a guy speaking, and he was saying, "Hey, oil is going to get back over $100 a barrel." And so I went home and told my wife, I was like, I think we should like invest $100,000 and buy some oil right now. And we didn't, and I really wish I would have, because it's probably worth like about $1 million right now.
Oh man,
short time. You just never know, right? On those kinds of things.
You could have been part of like those secret options trading that happened right before the announcement.
It was a public conference. I thought it was public information, right? He just giving his opinion. So no, I think those are always things that that we have to look at and navigate. I think the biggest challenge that any of these types of industries have is really around workforce, right? And there's just not enough people who are going into craft trades to support those businesses. So regardless of, the economics play a factor because, maybe it costs more to produce or less to produce or whatever it might be. And those things are always going to have the ebb and flows in the world. But it's also like, how do we continue to maintain these assets? How do we build new assets when we don't have a lot of folks that, want to go and be a welder or a carpenter or do some of those other kinds of trades? And so I think that's the continued tension that we have as we buy some of these businesses, is that there's such a need for like welders, for example, and then finding enough welders to be able to cover all the work that needs to get done across the country.
It's crazy just seeing the shift from when I was going to undergrad and the focus on the specific skills needed to thrive in the workplace to now, and how like the push for trades. I can't imagine being a parent, like sending a kid off to college right now and trying to figure things out with things changing so quickly. You shifted careers at kind of the height of this economic uncertainty around nuclear. Where did you go and what happened? Yeah.
So I had a guy that I knew. We had done some work in the past when I was at Day and Zimmerman, and he helped us build a couple of software applications. And he and I built quite a rapport because what we had kind of put together, the nuclear industry really liked it. And so we kind of proposed to Day and Zimmerman at the time, hey, why don't we do a joint venture and go sell this software, and it gets us further embedded into our clients. But D&Z was kind of like, yeah, that's not really what we do. And so it was kind of short lived, but we always stayed in touch. And this guy was kind of a serial entrepreneur. So he was always looking at new opportunities and data and information. And so in 2016, he got into drones and originally started off with creating an app for kind of casual drone users to be able to go on kind of like missions. And it was kind of a nonprofit organization where it's like, hey, we have a missing elderly person or a missing dog. And it would say, here's all the drone pilots in that area. Let's get a drone in the air and let's go find them. His business then kind of evolved into like doing inspections with drones, like, buildings, bridges, and that kind of thing. And then when COVID hit, Walmart was kind of experimenting with this idea of last mile delivery. And so he went out, did a demo, and Walmart made a big investment in his company. And so he called me up one day and he's like, hey, Kris, I got 12 employees. I need about 2,000 in 2 years. Wow. I'm going to be we're going to be at like, several, 100 to 1,000 Walmarts across the location. Would you come help me build this? And, I was like, wow, this kind of sounds like a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so I did it. I made the pivot and jumped over. And it was a blast. Like the first 18 months, we went from 12 employees to over 600 employees. We opened up 38 locations with Walmart. But we were kind of like that rocket ship that never hit the second stage. So we ended up having a failed raise with Goldman Sachs. It didn't work out. Amazon had kind of pivoted and was shutting down their drone program at the time, or giving indications of that. Walmart hit the brakes. And so we opened up 38 locations. We're now prepared to do 100 locations the next year, and they opened 0.
Yeah.
And so that went on for a few months, and they actually opened 0 that entire year. So I was brought in to help them scale. And when you're not scaling, then you don't need me. So Yeah, it was unfortunate because I mean there was a lot of excitement about the business. We hired a lot of people that moved from a lot of different states to go support that, and unfortunately, it fizzled out pretty quickly. And some of that, there's a lot of factors around that. I mean, some of it was regulation, regulation not moving as fast enough that as we needed it to move. We were kind of making a bet on, that we could be kind of an aggregator of software as opposed to actually having to build our own drones. And then we found that, the drone manufacturers couldn't keep up. So other folks like Wing, who's backed by Google, or Zipline, who's a Silicon Valley based firm, they were really focused on building the technology. And at the end of the day, that play is what won the day. So I know Walmart is still doing drone delivery. I think they're doing it with Wing now. So it's cool. The idea is still there. It just didn't quite fizzle out, or it fizzled out and didn't quite hit the Starship status that I was hoping it might. But learned a ton.
Yeah, I mean, me and my team were there, and it felt like there was so much energy and momentum in telling the story of what you guys were doing, and ultimately that just amazing people, talented. You guys really had to pull in a lot of talent to make it happen, and as the storytellers for a very short time of that in that season, it felt like it was a privilege to be a part of that, and it was intoxicating, like that startup feel. And I've been a part of that startup world before. That's when we met, and there's something about the culture of a startup that gets you believing that, okay, we're gonna make it. And what kind of struggles did you have in hiring and retaining talent, and especially when there's a large amount of pressure from someone like Walmart and potentially other investors in the room that are pushing things maybe too fast? Yeah.
No, absolutely. And hindsight, they say, is always 2020 or maybe 2030. I don't know what it is, but it's you see things a little bit different when you kind of step back. And I think that there were some pivotal times that, we were very focused with Walmart on, what it appeared to me is that Walmart was trying to beat Amazon, right? So it was like, if Amazon was going to open a location, Walmart's going to open 10, right? So we felt that pressure, and our technology really wasn't ready for that yet. So it was a huge kind of Herculean manpower effort to get that going. And the hope is that somehow they'd meet in the middle. So it's like, we get all this manpower going, we get the technology going, and then eventually you don't need as much manpower and the tech takes over. But we never could quite reach that in time before that happened. Whereas other companies like Wing and Zipline that I mentioned, they were focused on the tech and they were obsessed with the tech, and the tech won, at the end of the day. But probably, some of the biggest challenges, even with finding people, is you had to break down sometimes people's barriers or mindsets around, where can someone even work? So I know it was like, we were coming out of COVID, and so remote work was still somewhat new to people, but there was, we were based in Virginia Beach, and Virginia Beach is not a big tech hub, And so if you're going to get a developer that's in Seattle or somewhere in the Silicon Valley, they don't want to relocate to Virginia Beach, because if this thing doesn't work out, like, they can't just walk across the street and get a job, right? So some of that was trying to break down some of those barriers. I also found that a lot of startups early on, to attract people, they'll give them a small percent of the company or something like that. We tried to work out some, kind of like phantom type shares or whatever, but they were never really quite as tangible as what some of these other startups would actually give you. I'm going to give you a 0.5% or 1% in the company. And so sometimes attracting people to come out of those startup world that, hey, I've got something that could be, a rocket ship and come work for us was a challenge. Certainly our brand and the recognition we were getting around our brand was helpful, in finding these individuals. And there were also a lot of like drone pilots, if you will, who had graduated from places like Embry-Riddle and other places that were looking for jobs. And so it was kind of a new industry. And so it's like they get this degree and they're certified to fly drones, but then there's nowhere to actually go fly them or do it. So we kind of created that avenue. So we did attract a lot of drone pilots, but we struggled more on the tech talent because It was, we wanted them in Virginia Beach, and we had to kind of overcome some of those barriers that, hey, they can kind of work from anywhere. Had to get competitive with pay, had to get competitive with benefits, all those kinds of things that they would get in other places. But I definitely think, we were probably way too aggressive. Not probably, we were way too aggressive in just the ramp of people we were trying to bring into the organization. And just, I mean, you can only eat so much, right? You can only assimilate so much at a time. And then it just kind of becomes overload.
What did you learn about having a healthy amount of friction in those kind of high intensity creative environments? So like when the deadlines are coming, when the fundraising round fails, like what was the lesson that you took from being in those rooms with really smart people that just believe something differently than you?
Yeah. Well, I wish I could say that it was healthy friction because I don't think we had healthy friction. I think we had unhealthy friction, and I think that was some of the challenges, right? And I think that's one thing as a leader that we always have to be mindful of like, what's the environment we create, whether we're the CEO, the CFO, whatever position of leadership or managing a team. How do you create that environment where people can have differing views and you're willing to kind of explore those views, right? And not just shut them down. So I think that was some of the challenges we had even as a leadership team. I don't think that we were really aligned well, which I think affected culture. I think it affected direction and a lot of the things that we were doing.
Yeah. I have seen that in organizations I've worked in, and I just don't know how to operate or how to infuse a level of health and healthy dialogue into that when it's like, oh, this is a deep rooted issue.
Yeah. My first leadership team meeting, I actually saw it, and I was kind of shocked. I'm in the meeting, and there's something comes up, and there's kind of this argument that goes on, and one of the leaders gets mad and throws his stuff down on the table and walks out of the room for like 10 or 15 minutes. I was like, what in the world's happening? Then he comes back into the room like nothing had ever even happened. And I remember calling my wife because she was working on selling our house in Pennsylvania while had already started my job. And I was like, I might have made the wrong decision. Like this feels a little challenging, right? And I mean, so a lot of times people will look at Steve Jobs, for example, and look, Steve Jobs did a lot of great things, and he might be romanticized more than he should because he passed away and all those kinds of things. But most people that work with him know like he was really challenging to work with. And a lot of people wouldn't take the elevator. They would take the stairs because if you were on the elevator with him, there's a good chance you might get fired, right? So he didn't have the greatest culture. And some people say, well, yeah, but look at the success he had. Yeah, he did but at what cost? At what expense, right? Yeah. That's for me, it doesn't align with my values, right? Of how I want to lead and treat people,
Yeah.
So
I could have a whole podcast on this with you because I struggle with our society's infatuation with romanticizing morally bankrupt leaders that we're wishing that they're going to come through for some really amazing breakthrough. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to be polarizing, but we know there's all these leaders in our society that we will immediately just look past a lot of character flaws because they're bringing something to the table that is incredible. And I think Steve Jobs, his story's been retold so many times through books and movies and stuff. There's still I have a device in my pocket that was made possible by his bullish nature of stubbornness and stuff. So a lot of people think that the ends is worth it, that for the journey that it takes to create that innovation, that breakthrough, if we're okay letting go a couple character flaws, we're going to keep doing it. But I don't know if that sends the best message to our society. And if that erodes a certain level of integrity and boundaries that we're willing to tolerate. So I don't know. We'll see. I think we have a lot of those personalities today in our world that we're going to see at the end of their life, like what their legacy is going to be. I just know that, okay, those are 1 in a million, 1 in a billion kind of leaders. The day-to-day leaders that are looking at them and thinking, oh, I can be that way because I'm changing the world. No, you're not changing the world. You're affecting 20 to 100 people max. Just don't be a jerk in the process.
Absolutely.
So that's my soapbox moment.
No. I mean, and it's a good one. I mean, I guess in some ways, Steve Jobs had a reputation. I think Elon Musk has a reputation, right? But a lot of people, when they go to work for those companies like SpaceX or Tesla or whatever, they kind of know what they're getting into because they've heard about it. You're going to work your tail off, and this is whatever is going to happen. But guess what? The resume you're going to have when you come out of there is going to do it. So they kind of know going in, eyes wide open, of this is the leader. And I think even with Steve Jobs, there was some of that as well. What I really struggle with are leaders that act like that's not who they are. And we're this great culture, but that's really who they are, right? Where it's a bit deceptive, right? Of like, now, like, I'm walking into something and like, wow, I didn't even realize this is what I was walking into. I would also say too, to your point about where people are more forgiving, there was an article on this many years ago that talked about, like, the sexier the brand, the more forgiving people are, And so if it's a sexy brand or it's a popular brand, I think you can see this with like athletes and other people. Like, they can have big indiscretions, and at first it's a big bombshell, but then, a year or two goes by and it's completely forgotten, right? Because it's almost like the entertainment value that they bring to us and satisfaction, we kind of overlook that. And I think it's the same with, like, whether it's an iPhone, right? And we say, oh gosh, iPhones are made in China and China has oppressive, labor policies but we kind of overlook it because, like, the iPhone's my whole ecosystem. Everything's there. I love what it does for me. So I can kind of like compartmentalize that out, right? So I do think that that's part of our psyche, right? And I think that's the justification or rationalization that leaders sometimes make, is that I can be a jerk because Jobs was a jerk or Musk or whoever was a jerk, and I'm going to change the world. And to your point, you probably aren't. And number two is that, why don't you change the world and still be a good human being, right?
Yeah. And it'll come at a cost, maybe, of maybe things not happening as fast as you want it to, maybe not even in your lifetime, which is like letting go of your ego even. But I don't know. I can see the collateral damage of a bad leader. And then what does that do as a ripple effect? And then back to, your faith background and my faith background, I can see the collateral damage in those spaces that are supposed to be safer, that are supposed to be people with character and integrity and following a certain set of values, but they're not living that out. So, I mean, you have talked a lot about this. You leave Drone Up. Where do you go next?
I went to work for, I started doing some independent consulting work. And that got me connected to a consulting firm out of Richmond, Virginia. And really how I got connected to them was there was a private equity firm that was in the nuclear space, and Fahrenheit was looking for somebody that had some nuclear background. I had met the founder. He remembered I did, and so I did a project for him. So then once I did the project for them, the founders approached me and said, hey, we'd actually like you to join the firm, but we want to sell the firm. And they said, we'd really like you to help us accelerate our growth. Let's get to a place where we can get to an exit and then move forward. And so that's what we did. It was a great experience. We went in there and grew the business by about 20%, got them to a great exit. And then they kind of became part of a larger platform that had consulting and tax and other types of finance things, and did that for a while until I pivoted over into private equity.
Okay. So, but in your time at Fahrenheit, you were also helping clients through M&A, right?
We did. Yeah. So we did everything from, like, it could just be, we tend to work with like lower middle market companies. So think companies that, somewhere up to 100 to $200 million in revenue value, some smaller, some bigger. And so we would help them with HR, finance, strategy, those kinds of things. And then we had a private equity arm where if they were, maybe it's helping them on the diligence side to uncover aspects of the business, or post integration where they needed support, or first 100 days, kind of get that organization set up. Those were a lot of the things that we did. So it's kind of a natural progression for me to kind of go from there into this, private equity firm and help them evaluate businesses and then kind of work with them kind of post integration to get those businesses rolling.
I liked the example that you gave about the bookshelves, I think, or the books, and that you're collecting this knowledge and bites of wisdom along the way, and then you don't know later on how they're all going to overlap and how are you going to use them. And now today, you're in the private equity space that is in, like you mentioned, in the energy field, both gas and oil and nuclear.
Yep.
And it's bringing together a lot of your background. How does creating healthy cultures fit into that? And now that you're looking at organizations that could become part of the portfolio, is culture a competitive advantage?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, let me go back to the point you made about the buckets connecting, because when I got my first job, outside of like pastoral work, I think what helped me be successful was the fact that when I worked as a pastor, I had to speak publicly, I had to lead teams, right? I had to cast vision, I had to do all of those things that were, transferable skills. And so it really helped me early on in my career. It's like, oh, this guy can speak well, he can go to conferences, he can do training. Like, so all those things that I learned in my early church work actually translated well. I also think it translated in the aspect of my passion around culture too, right? Of like viewing human beings as more than just cogs in a wheel, right? We're made in the image of God. Like people need to be able to flourish. And then to your point is, when I was in the nuclear industry, I had no idea I'd spend 20 years there. Had no idea I'd go into the technology space and a startup and then go into consulting. But what I found is all those pieces have connected, because there's a lot of businesses that I've worked with that are startups, right? And how do I help them and accelerate them? Some that have a technology focus, right? And then others that we work with, even on the private equity side, are much more field services, labor intensive, which is what Day and Zimmerman did. So again, it's one of those, to your point, of all of those kinds of pieces connecting together. I think on the culture side, I honestly think in private equity, this is probably an area that people don't focus enough on, right? Because most private equity folks are, they're investment bankers, or, that's kind of where they came out of. One thing I would say about Pelican is that all of those guys came out of the field. So they have some appreciation for, what it is to actually work in the business. And, they're not just spreadsheet jockeys, if you will. But at the end of the day, people are looking at the numbers. How well is the business doing? How well is it going to, how much is it going to grow? What's the EBITDA? What do I think I can sell this company for? At what multiple in, 3 to 5 years? And of course, every deck you see from someone selling their company, it's always a hockey stick, right? It's like, we've been doing this growth here, now we're going to go boom. It's just going to, accelerate. Everyone I've never seen anyone say, we're going to stay flat or we're going to go down, right? But the problem is what founders don't realize when they do that hockey stick, the PE firm's going to hold you to that hockey stick, right? And that's going to drive a lot of your earnouts or incentives that you're going to get later on in terms of the financial value. So I don't think we look enough at culture when we look at these organizations, and are they set up to succeed? And what is the founder's role going forward? Because a lot of times in businesses that we're buying, you could have a founder that's like, hey, I just want to retire and get out of the business. And they may put him on a 1 or 2 year earnout. He or she might have that earnout period, and then they walk away. Others, hey, they've reached kind of as far as they can get in terms of, private capital, other capitals that they can, exhaust. Now they need some private equity funds to really kind of grow to the next level and make those investments. That's kind of a different strategy. Or there's some that, they could be a turnaround case. It's like, this is a business that's got a lot of opportunity. It just doesn't have the right leadership or management. But I think going in is understanding, one, what is that culture? What's the founder's role in that company going forward? Because, you have somebody who started a business, their identities are very tied up into their business, right? And so when you come in and start saying, hey, your baby's a little ugly, like they get pretty offended by that. Or you start making a change and they're like, well, it was perfect when I had it, or why are you doing that? And yeah, you're changing my company, you're changing my culture. So I see that a lot. So I think you have to really have really candid conversations about what's the founder's role going forward. And we're not just talking about on an org chart, but are they now an ambassador? Are they an advisor? Are they a champion? Are they going to exit? Or are they still going to run the business? And with what kind of controls or oversight? Because in the past, they probably had no control or no one really kind of governing what control they could put on the business, right? So that I think is probably the biggest culture shock when you buy a company is like, what does that look like for the founders who are running the business? Because we do buy a lot of founder-led businesses.
I have a lot of experience through my work I do with CultureWise, telling their stories. And oftentimes there's that trajectory of we started this, it grew very fast, and then the identity shifts a little bit from the founder, but it's still very grounded in the founder. So my response to you is this. I think, and this, PE, private equity, gets a lot of bad press. When you tell people you're working in private equity, you might get a response like, oh, are you going to come in and buy the business that I love and I've known all my life and strip it of what makes it unique and make it an inferior product because it's, 5% cheaper? What would you tell that skeptic that might be listening that's different about how you approach this process, especially knowing that you've seen, again, from your grandparents' generation to now, this disloyal kind of spirit in corporate America that if you're a cog and I could strip you, take you out of the company and save 5%, you're gone. Like, what would you tell that skeptic right now?
Yeah, well, I would tell them that in many cases they're not wrong, right? And we do see that a lot in private equity. I just for me personally, there are things that private equity is involved in that I'm like, why are you guys involved in that? There was a local dentist that I had, right? And every time I go back, there was a different dentist. And I was like, what's going on? Like, how come we can't keep dentists? And they got bought up by a private equity company that was consolidating all these dentists, right? They're doing like car washes, veterinarians, all these kinds of things.
HVAC.
Yeah. So my service feels like it's going down, right? Because they're trying to squeeze the buck. So that absolutely does happen, right? Because they are looking at, how do you drive efficiency, optimization, improve EBITDA, grow revenue, so they can get some kind of multiple. So I will say that in some cases, private equity has done damage, and I think it's created a lot of frustration with people. What I like about the firm that I'm with today is that, and I think some of this comes again from their roots of being in the field. It's kind of an interesting dynamic because sometimes like when they buy a business, I can see some of the issues. And so I get into like fix it mode and I'm like, let's go help them get this, where they're more like kind of holding me back and saying, hey, like, let's let them kind of work through this. Like, they want them to be entrepreneurial. They don't want to create a lot of bureaucracy with decision making. They want them to feel like they have an identity and a strategy and how can they grow. And now you're under different ownership. So what were the constraints you had before? And now how can we help you accelerate? Now, at the end of the day, do they want to see growth? Yes. Like they want to see top line and bottom line growth, 100%. And but the truth is, like, if you have a healthy organization, if you've got a good strategy, like those things should, occur somewhat naturally, depending on the market that you're in. And so I think it's just really the approach, because I have definitely seen private equity firms where it's like every month it's just a grueling board deck and they're just hammering you on the numbers all the time. And what are you going to do different, or how are you going to make cuts or whatever, versus like, hey, what do we need to do? And if we need to do a J curve where we got to need to invest a little bit, so the numbers are going to go down a little bit so that we can get a bigger, ROI in the future, then let's make those kinds of investments, right? So I don't think all private equity are created equal, but I do agree that, there are some out there that we've experienced, as consumers that have not made the world better.
Yeah, you look at the back of your favorite like sriracha, bottle, and then like, wait, the ingredients changed. What happened? Oh, PE. It's
messed it up.
Yeah.
Why are they in sriracha? Just leave it alone. Right?
Yeah. I think maybe there is out there a model for redemptive PE that hold in tension the values of human dignity and human capital and excellence and efficiency and synergy. I don't know. If that exists, it may or not exist for long before, greed or whatever kind of sneaks in there. But I'm sure whoever cracks that and then also can crack the messaging behind that will get a lot more buy-in from public sentiment, I think.
Yeah. Well, it kind of comes back, and you'll remember this from your studies at Messiah when we did some research with Jeff Van Duzer, right? And one of the things I liked about how Van Duzer would paint out when he talks about business is he said, really a business fundamentally exists to produce a product or service that allows a community to flourish, right? I mean, if you think about it, we all need businesses. We need dry cleaners and restaurants and grocery stores and all those things for just humans to survive, right? Mm-hmm. And if we have more businesses that think about like, what are the things that I'm doing that allow my communities to flourish, as opposed to taking advantage of my community so that I can benefit. And that's a human nature issue. That's a human dilemma we have, right? So I think that's where, having, my faith lens has helped inform that around, like there's got to be more to business than just purely, increasing, value to shareholders,
right.
know, as Milton Friedman would say, right? It's got to do more than that, right? It also has to help communities flourish and allow those peoples to engage in creative and meaningful work. So to your point, if private equity firms or other investors can come along and say, gosh, I see a really great business here that has potential, that could even have more impact in their communities and even adjacent communities, like that could be significant. And guess what? Yeah, we can make a profit, but that's the natural kind of byproduct of building a great business, right?
Yeah.
It just naturally occurs versus like, I'm just going to squeeze this thing for everything it's worth. Everybody hates that company now because of what they've become, but yeah, we've made, great money.
And I remember quoting Simon Sinek in one of my papers that I probably submitted to your class, and the infinite game, and with game theory, and that profit in a business becomes the fuel to continue the infinite game. So if the infinite game is, we want to just sustain this flourishing communities, and it never ends. So there's no end here. So there's no winning. So how do we sustain it? Well, the fuel is the profit, and then it allows you to grow the vision. So again, not a lot of people, I think about business that way, but I think a lot of people, if they were introduced to this, would agree like, wow, that sounds great, but like what you said, human nature, it's hard.
Yeah. Well, Michael Porter at Harvard, I mean, he actually gave a great lecture on this, and he said, businesses are really probably in the best position to solve some of the biggest human challenges, right? Because to your point, they can do things at scale. Because as a nonprofit, you're always in this kind of fundraising, but if you can make something that can produce a profit that you can then reinvest back into the business to grow it at scale, like, it can become infinite, right? In terms of what it could solve, right? So we need more people thinking about business in terms of, like, what's the mission? What is it that I'm trying to actually solve for? Some human issue or challenge that my product or service can create value that would allow humans to flourish. And guess what? Profit will become a natural byproduct of that, you know, but sometimes we get the equation backwards, right?
Agreed. So we've quoted a couple academics. let's shift to this thing that's been in the background of your career, is this desire to be in higher education. Tell me a little bit about like why you've just had that be a part of your career journey. And I want to also talk about the state of higher ed, but just give me a little intro how you got into it, and because that's how we met.
Yeah. Well, my original thinking was like when I was going to be a pastor, I thought, gosh, sometimes being a pastor can be tough. And I never really liked the idea of living off of, people's donations. So I was like, I need to work. So nothing against pastors that live off donations, but I struggled with it. So I was like, if maybe I could teach or be a professor, and that could kind of supplement, what I would do at a church. So that was the original thought behind it, and why I got into a PhD program, which was probably the toughest and craziest thing I ever did, and not sure I'd do it again. But again, it's one of those things. Looking back, it's opened up a lot of doors and opportunities I didn't expect to have. So when I finished my PhD program, I was looking really kind of for an outlet to be able to do that, and so I really kind of started moonlighting as a adjunct professor, and then later as a professor. So I always kind of had one foot in academia and one foot in the business world. What's interesting is the pace at academia is so slow that I could do side hustles. I could consult, I could work, because it's like we don't move very fast over here. Like, so, I was used to being in business where you just go. But I also saw it as a way to, like, how do I give back, right? How do I kind of invest in the next generation of leaders? Is there, in a meaningful way? So that's really what's led to that. So I've been teaching in higher ed now since probably like 2014 or so.
I distinctly remember you being one of those champions that you talk about, that you mentioned earlier on, to me specifically. This has been brought up in other episodes in this podcast, but sometimes you need people to tell you, hey, you think about things differently, or I think, you'd be really good at X or Y. And I distinctly remember feeling a lot of imposter syndrome doing an MBA. Like, I'm a filmmaker. Why am I doing an MBA? And I think I remember when I met you and kind of you wooed me into the MBA program, you kind of, I don't think it was like fake hype, unless it was, and it was really good. Just this idea of, after you got to know me a little bit, to kind of champion me into someone who I wasn't yet. Like, I hadn't become that person yet, and I still am becoming, I think, that person. But I thought that was really cool. So for you, how important was it to impact the next generation, especially with the state of higher ed being the way it is? Like, why are you still doing that today?
Yeah. Well, no, it's a great question. And it is becoming more challenging, I would say. I had a professor one time that said, when I was going through my PhD program, he was like, very shortly, you're going to be able to call yourself a doctor. But he said, what's even more cool than that is that you think like a doctor, you ask questions like a doctor, you probe, you listen, and it's really kind of this whole aspect of matriculation, of the process of becoming. It's like the caterpillar kind of becoming the butterfly. And that's really kind of what education was supposed to be, right? It's like this matriculation of becoming, but we've lost that, right? And so you don't really find a lot of students. And that's one of the things I enjoyed about having you in the program, is because you wanted to eat up everything that you were, able to take in, right? You wanted to kind of think about it deeply, process it. How does that impact how you think today? How's that going to shape you for the future? You don't have a lot of students that do that, right? A lot of it is, I want to come in, get my assignments done. They're going to use AI tools, right? So now you're figuring out how to engineer assignments where they maybe could use AI, but still use critical thinking skills. And they just want to get it done, get a grade, and get out, right? And it really only kind of hurts them in the long run, right? It's kind of like when you go to the gym, it's like we want instant results, but it takes years of it's a long obedience in the same direction, as Eugene Peterson would say. It's like, you just got to keep grinding, and eventually you see those kinds of results. And so I think we've lost a lot of that. as a society. I don't know how it is in the UK or other places, but particularly in the US, we've lost a lot of that. So you don't see as many students coming in. There's still a few.
Right.
I might have 2 or 3 in a class of 30 that have that.
I think it's interesting hearing you say that, because I look back at who I was back then. What drove me to do the program was probably unconventional motivation. So at the time, I thought I was going to rise up in leadership in an organization that I'm no longer a part of. And I thought, okay, this will be a tool. And of course, a lot of people see graduate degrees as a ticket to higher pay, higher roles in an organization. And then I'm also thinking, okay, I'm going to an online graduate school program. So already the people that know the graduate school world is, if you're not going to the top 20 business programs in the country, you're not really going to gain the benefits of the social capital of being associated with that school. I also had to pay my way through it. I didn't have like a sponsorship from like my job that sometimes you have the tuition reimbursement. So I think when I got there, I was very much motivated by learning and also not knowing what the heck an MBA was going to do for me either. Because then shortly after I left that organization, and I'm like, I remember calling you, and I don't know if you remember this conversation. I said, hey, I'm not working there anymore. I'm struggling with whether I should continue the MBA. And, ultimately decided it was right. But then the last year and a half was all just motivated by education. That, I don't think I was motivated by that in my undergrad at all. I was just, that's what you do. That's life stage number 4, So I think that's probably the difference. I look back at that time and really, I was definitely hungry for knowledge. And even today, I sometimes wonder, if I were to be a little bit honest, I wonder, I have this knowledge, it's great. I don't know where it fits necessarily, but it's kind of like that bucket analogy that maybe one day in the future, it will come into complete sense, the dots will connect.
Well, I think it already has for you. I mean, some of the networks, right? We're having this conversation, right? So it's created networks, opportunities for you to work with other businesses. You're starting your own business, thinking through strategy, all those kinds of things that, and I think you'll see broader value of that. But I do think you bring up an interesting point. Now, look, if you can go to a top tier school or whatever, great, go to that. That's not everybody's path or journey, right? Sometimes people can't get into those. I couldn't get into one of those. I couldn't afford one of those, right? So I had to go a different path. I would also say, and I'm not saying this to sound braggadocious, but when I worked in Philly with some folks at Day and Zimmerman who were all Wharton MBAs, there were some of those guys I could run circles around, right? Now, there were others that were worth their salt. Now, because it's not just where you go to school, it's also the athlete, right? And how much you put into it, right? So just because you go to Wharton or Harvard doesn't mean that, you're spectacular, right? It's really, what did you put into that education regardless of where you went? So some of it, as I kind of mentioned earlier, this is a bit of my soapbox, is that, people like to kind of compare, I went to this school as some sort of validation, but at the end of the day, it comes down to initiative and work ethic and what did you put into where you went. That's the big deal. I think in terms of the imposter side that you talk to, I think everybody struggles with that everywhere we go. Every new job we walk into, it's like, oh my God, I'm going to be found out, right?
Yeah.
But we learn through imitation, right? There's actually a scripture passage I love about that, where it talks about how that we are to imitate Christ, right? Because this idea that the more that we imitate, the more we become, right? So when we were young kids, how do we learn how to eat? Because our parents would we learned through imitation, right? And eventually we become. So it's even if you want to be a cowboy, how do you become a cowboy? You learn through intimidation or imitation, I should say.
Intimidation.
Not intimidation. Yeah. I can be intimidating too. You learn through imitation till you actually become that, right? And I think people worry about that, and people get weird about, well, you're an imposter, or you didn't come up the way I did, kind of like the whole construction thing we talked about. But at the end of the day, you decide that you want to learn something and you become a master at it. And, but you got to start somewhere,
Yeah. Yeah. So back, this, you gave me a great segue, back to this, idea of you and your cowboy identity. I want to
alter ego.
Yeah, alter ego. I still remember when we were at one of those drone up video shoots that you had your boots on. I'm like, oh, that's Kris, and then boom, I don't know how you're going to show up today. And boom, I see the big hat. I want to shift gears to this personal / passion project of yours. You've developed this ranch brand, Twin Tiers Ranch. Tell me a little bit about it. Where did it come from? And why is it important for you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking about it. So originally I had bought some property with no intention to make it into a ranch or farm. When I moved to Pennsylvania has a big hunting culture. And so everybody I work with, they hunt white-tailed deer, black bear, turkey, those kinds of things. And so growing up, my grandfather did that when my grandfather's originally from Pennsylvania. But he was older and really didn't have any interest. So I didn't learn how to hunt when I was in California. So I really learned from guys in Pennsylvania. So my son, Mason, since the time he was young, he wanted to be out there hunting with me. So probably as young as 4 years old, he was out there. He was in the blind. He wasn't shooting anything, but he was in the blind. And then as he got older, he got a crossbow and rifle, and then he's become a really good hunter where now it's a competition, and he always seems to do better than I do each year with the size of the deer and getting more deer. But we started looking for property at the time because we were hunting on these like public game lands. And if you ever hunt on public game lands, I think it's like the worst experience.
Mm-hmm.
We would go out in the utter corner of the game lands and up in a tree stand and think, oh, there's nobody out here. And then somebody would roll up on their ATV and drink beer and be loud. And like, it was terrible. So I started looking for hunting property, and in Pennsylvania, it was pretty expensive because it was going through the natural gas and shale movement. And, but if you went over to just over the border in New York, there was a moratorium on all that and you could buy land pretty cheap. Mm-hmm. And so I found some land over there that we originally bought as hunting property. And then once I got there, I was like, gosh, this can be so much more. It was interesting when I bought the property, there was the deed it was probably like that thick of like who had owned it, the history of the property, everything from, growing potatoes to a Christmas tree farm to they had a deer lease. I mean, all kinds of different things. And I thought, how could I kind of bring some of that back to life and also kind of merge some of these passions that I've always had about, potentially ranching or farming. It was always kind of I never really thought when I was young I could be a farmer because land was so expensive in California. Like the cost to buy land, tractors, like that just seems so unrealistic to me. And now that I've gotten older, I'm at a place where I can do that. In New York, it's obviously a lot cheaper to buy property there than it is in California. So that's what really started. Now, what's interesting about my family roots is that my grandfather, my great grandfather, they were all farmers. They had a 1,000-acre farm in Pennsylvania, in Towanda, Pennsylvania, which is just about 30 minutes from where my property is today. They had moved to California in the 1950s, and because my great grandfather was in World War I, had some health issues, that kind of thing. And when they landed in California was still very agricultural. So like their first jobs were working farms in California. So it was always kind of part of my culture and DNA. Even my mom, even though my mom and dad got a divorce, she got remarried to a rodeo guy. He rode bulls and did, roping, and they ran a ranch in San Jose. So I'd go out there every week and ride horses. So it was always kind of part of who I was, but it was kind of suppressed, if you will. And it was always something I had a desire for. So once we bought the property, we started developing it, and we put a pole barn on it and a pond and a pasture, and then started raising, growing hay. And then we've looked at potentially growing hops because there's a lot of breweries that are popping up in that area. So that works pretty well. I'd like to do cattle. I like to do Black Angus cattle. That I'd probably need a little bit more property for that. So I'm looking into that. But when we came up with the name for the ranch, And again, talking about buckets connecting. So I was like, what's a good name for this ranch? And so back in the mid 90s, there was a pastor named Rick Warren. A lot of people might know him. He wrote the book, The Purpose Driven Life. Well, there's actually a book he wrote before that called The Purpose Driven Church. And it's a great book to read, even if you're not a church person, but you're in business, because it was just great things about purpose, mission, strategy, who you want to reach. Well, there was one section there where we talked about where he had to name his church. And at the time, everybody was like getting creative about, it's got to be, Crossroads or Cornerstone or whatever, and the name was going to attract people. And so he defied all those. And he just said, we named our church Saddleback Church because we were at the bottom of the Saddleback Mountains. And it just represented the area and who we were, and there was no fluff about it. And so that always kind of stuck with me. And I said, when I named this ranch, I want it to be something that honors the area and the heritage, and also honors my family heritage, who farmed this area for years. And so in the 1960s, the Elmira Gazette put out this thing, they named the area the Twin Tiers. And they were struggling because the lower part of New York, the southern part of New York, they called the Southern Tier, and the northern part of Pennsylvania called the Northern Tier. And they thought it was weird that the Southern Tier was north of the Northern Tier. It was always like a quandary for them. So they said, we're going to call this area the Twin Tiers. But it never really caught on. Like, people don't really use it that much. But you'll see a Twin Tiers car wash or, occasionally. So I said, this name, one, it reflects the region. It gives honor to the region. It reflects that, I had family that farmed in Pennsylvania in the Northern Tier. I had family that were in the Southern Tier of New York. And serendipitously, my property has two tiers, an upper and a lower of pastures. And so I was like, this was just meant to be. So we named it the Twin Tiers Ranch.
What does doing this project and all the ideas that you have for it, like, what is that doing for your soul? What is that doing for like your interests? You have so many other things you're working on in your professional life. What does having this on the side mean to you?
Yeah. Well, if I could do it full time, I would, hopefully someday I can. I think what I realized when I was out there, that there's not a lot I enjoy more than sitting on top of a John Deere tractor for a day and a half mowing my pasture. I know this sounds like so boring to some people, but I was like, gosh, this is amazing. I mean, there's just something about, and I think most people probably find where they get re-energized, where they go into the mountains or whatever. But, the Finger Lakes area of New York is just beautiful. Mountains, trees, rolling hills. And there's just something about there where you can just kind of quiet all the noise, which I think is what the attraction that you see in some of these Taylor Sheridan movies, right? Whether it's in Montana, he's got a new one out called The Madison, which uses this great illustration of the New York City life versus this life out in Montana. Is that we're always going so fast all the time that we're never really kind of stopping and taking time just to be in the moment and to reflect. And I almost kind of feel like that's how God wanted us to live. We're always striving all the time. And so for me, I think it's become that of not only a getaway, but really kind of the simplicity that I really desire in life that I sometimes find really hard to find, and that's probably the thing I would encourage most people, that, we can become very career driven. We can strive. Some of that's tied to our identity. Some of it's tied to us wanting to prove ourselves or to feel like we're enough. But it's like the simplicity, the life of simplicity, and, really being able to slow down is, I think, what I value most. So yeah, that's kind of the heart and soul of the ranch and what we're doing, and hope that we can share that kind of idea and lifestyle and get other people interested in doing some of that stuff as well.
Sounds awesome. I think when I read the doc you sent over, it really felt like it could go in so many different directions, with just even the whole merch stuff, having fun with the actual literal brand, and creating some cool, apparel but also just even the spirit of what you could be doing in the land itself. I know that you have lots of ideas, so I look forward to hearing more as things develop there.
Yeah. Well, nobody thinks about cowboys in New York or farmers in New York. I was at the Houston rodeo recently, and I was looking at a new John Deere tractor, and the guy says to me, "What, you have tractors that big in New York?" And I was like, "Son, let me tell you something. We got some big farms up in New York." So yeah, people think of New York City, they don't think of all the big farming community and cattle and everything that's raised in the broader state of New York.
So, today you are married to Deidre and have a daughter and a son. When you think about your life, the work that you've been doing, work, family, legacy at this stage of life, what do you think feels most important for you to preserve or build or pass on?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So something as my kids were growing up, I just made up this thing. I called it the Cravey Credo, and we had a little chalkboard thing, and we wrote it down, and it was pretty simple. It was love God with all your heart, love people, stay out of debt, and find something that you're really passionate about and do with all your heart. I was like, you do those 4 things in life, you're probably pretty successful, right? Have a good relationship with God, have a good relationship with your neighbor and people, be kind. I said stay out of debt because early in my life, that was not my story, right? I was putting a lot of debt in to get educated and all those kinds of things. I didn't have those resources, which then created a lot of additional stresses in my life that I didn't need in our family. So it was like, how do you stay out of debt? So helping them, like my daughter's finished up college, she got out of there debt free. Same with my son. How do I set them up for success to do that? And then the passion piece, I would say that, I disagree with, there's some leaders, I think Steve, we were talking about Jobs. I think he was one of these guys that said, if you look at yourself in the mirror and you're not passionate about what you're doing, you need to quit and go find something you're passionate about. That seems like so silly to me because most people don't have that opportunity, right? You know what I mean? Most people don't have, I want to go pursue I want to go sing, or I want to go do some people just don't have that opportunity. They have a grind in front of them. They work in a factory, or they work, in this particular job, and they might like it, they may hate it, but some of it's just, they got to work, right? So not everybody's privileged to do something they're passionate about, but even in the midst of whatever your career is, you can still find what are the things that give you the most joy, that interest you, and how do you feed those, right? Because I think that's what I learned from my grandparents, is that they kind of lost that somewhere in the mix. And so as they got older and as they retired, they just kind of existed. They didn't have anything that woke them up in the morning that they were passionate about or they wanted to pursue or go after. And it was kind of broke my heart a bit. It was kind of sad, right? Because it's just like, I'm just existing until I die. And so for them, regardless of what career they find themselves in, what's that thing that wakes you up in the morning that you get excited about? And that's probably for me, my wife says I'm a bit of a Renaissance guy because I like a lot of different things. And when I learn about something, I want to go deep and wide. So if I'm going to learn about cattle, I learn everything I can about cattle. If I'm going to drink bourbon, I'm going to learn everything I know about bourbon or cigars or whatever it might be. That's just kind of how I'm wired. So it's like, find some of those things and go deep, and that's what I hope for my kids. To me, that's my real legacy. And I also think my friends, the people I did community with, as the great philosopher Brad Pitt once said, he was at an award show and someone said, well, what's more important? Is it the destination or the journey? And he said, it's the company. And that was pretty profound to me, because it's like a lot of us, we either get focused on a destination or we say, well, it's the journey of becoming. But the truth is, it's the people that we share it with along the way that make it the journey worthwhile, right? That make the destination worthwhile, the friends, the family, the people. And so as part of my legacy, I hope that, I have impact people, friends, when they look back, they think fondly of that I was a champion for them, that I love them. I might have gave them a little heck here and there. And, if you know my personality, I'm a little bit of a prankster and I'm going to talk some smack, but you got to know it's all in good love.
Yeah. Yeah. You painted a picture there that I also Just love this idea that the company along the way is really, I think, the valuable part of the experience too. I'm all for just not thinking about, okay, the destination's important, but I think if you don't see that along the way, the people that are part of that with you are actually going to make it so much more enjoyable. I feel like that's kind of what I recognize looking back, and what prompted me to start this podcast was along the way, I've met some awesome people, and your story is so different than everybody else's story, and it'll continue to be that way. But I know we can just hang out and have a good time together and make memories. And I look forward to one day being on your ranch, having some barbecue from, some Angus and maybe a beer from one of the hops that, you've cultivated on property. And that for me is just a great, I think, expression of what you said before, going deep and wide. I don't think you have to pick. And you can enjoy life that way and still be a nice person and not be a jerk and just enjoy the journey.
Absolutely. I think, one kind of departing quote that always stuck with me was Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "We're always getting ready to live, but never living." And I see that so much where people are always focused on, well, when I get to retirement or when I get to this, like I get to some stage, it's like, no, you need to live now. Like you need to enjoy life now, enjoy the company, enjoy the journey, enjoy the destination, be curious, learn new things, take new things on. Don't worry about being an imposter. Yeah, you're going to imitate a little bit at first, but eventually imitation turns into mastery, and, just get out there and do it.
Yeah. Well, Kris, thanks again for the conversation. It's so cool for me to think that 6 years after our initial paths crossed in an MBA class, we'd be having a conversation like this, just kind of recapping everything. And that's honestly what this podcast is really about. The people we meet, the experiences we carry, the perspectives we glean along the way, all shape who we become. So
absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rolando.
Yeah.
Really appreciate the friendship and encouragement throughout my career and the short time we've known each other.
Thanks, Kris. Really appreciate it. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. I'm Rolando, and this is The Power of Human Stories.
You've been listening to The Power of Human Stories. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might appreciate it. Visit powerofhumanstories.com for more.